Hello, it's Adam from the Tudor Chest here. In addition to running the Tudor Chest, you may also know that I'm also the co-director of Simply Tudor Tours, a historic tour company that I run alongside my colleague and my friend, Dr. Sarah Morris, who is known to many of you as the Tudor Travel Guide. Our May 2026 tour is now live for bookings. Mary Queen of Scots from Crown to Captivity. This incredible 8-day-long experience will take in many of the most iconic historical sites in bonnie Scotland associated with Mary, including Stirling Castle, Edinburgh Castle and the Palace of Holyrood House, featuring Dr. Anna Turnham as our historian in residence and featuring talks from noted historians including a certain Dr. Linda Porter. This tour will feature some fun, thoroughly Scottish experiences, including a very nice whisky tasting evening that I am very excited about. To secure your spot, and there are just a few remaining, head over to simplytudortours.com. Almost from the moment that her head was severed from her body, Jane Boleyn, Viscountess Rochford, has been an easy scapegoat for all of the drama surrounding the downfall of her husband George, sister-in-law Anne Boleyn, and the teenage Queen Katherine Howard that she was executed alongside. And yet, in reality, when one examines the evidence, there is basically nothing to support the long-held belief that Jane was an evil shrew who actively plotted against the family that she had married into. To discuss this fascinating woman with me, I'm thrilled to welcome Julia Fox onto the podcast for the first time. Julia is a historian who needs no introduction, but I will give her one anyway. Julia's first book centred around Jane, hence her being invited on to discuss Jane Boleyn with me today. But most recently, she co-authored a book alongside her husband, John Guy, all about the relationship between Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, and that book is, of course, Hunting the Falcon. Julia joins me today to discuss Jane's story, the truth of her role in the downfall of the Boleyns in May 1536, what happened to her after, what on earth she was thinking about when aiding in Katherine Howard's adultery, and what her actual legacy should be. Welcome back to the Tudor Chest podcast, episode 93, Jane Boleyn, Viscountess Rochford, with Julia Fox. Welcome to the Tudor Chest podcast, Julia Fox. How are you?
Oh, thank you very much. It's great to be here.
So we're here to talk about a fascinating woman, a woman that I think has been much unfairly maligned over the years, Jane Boleyn, Viscountess Rochford. Before we get to her, a few questions to get to know you a bit better. So could you provide me with a short introduction into your background? So where you grew up and what you now do full time?
Well, I was born and sort of grew up really in Finsbury Park, North London. And I was, still am, a voracious reader. Summer holidays was book after book after book after book. It was great. When I was at primary school, an aunt bought me a blackboard needle. And I used to teach my teddy and various other very well-educated toys that I had. And the die was cast I wanted to be a teacher. And so, that's what I became. And I taught history for 17 years in a state comprehensive in Haringey, and then moved to the private sector and taught history for about 14 years there, and then started to write. I wrote Jane Boleyn. That was my first book. And then another one, Sister Queens. And then the last one has been with my husband. As people probably know, he's a Tudor historian. So, since I have a love of the Tudor period anyway, that's great. And many a discussion has been had on Tudor history, literally in the middle of the night. And it has to be digestive biscuits, no others do. I don't know why it is. It has to be digestive. And we have picked over many a problem in the middle of the night.
Well, for those listening who might be slightly confused, we're talking, of course, about John Guy and the fact that you co-wrote Hunting the Falcon, about the relationship between Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn.
Yes.
Wonderful book. So I would
Thank
definitely
you.
recommend people, if they haven't read it or listened to it, I have both physical copy and I listened to it on Audible as well. It's utterly brilliant. So you mentioned there you've always had a passion for Tudor history. Can you recall something growing up that sparked your passion for Tudor history in particular?
I wish I could. I
Okay.
can't. I actually grew up loving history, full stop.
Mm,
I can't say I went to, I don't know, Hever Castle or the Tower of London and saw the spot where she was supposed to, in fact, it wasn't quite there, but the spot where she was supposed to have been executed. I can't really. I taught across the board when I taught history, but just found myself drawn more and more towards the Tudor period. And obviously I had European history, etc., etc.
yeah.
The kids always liked Tudor history, I think, the most. Well, it's sort of sex, sin, and
Yeah.
beheadings, isn't it? You're onto a bit of a winner, really. But I, I just loved it, and became very interested in the characters. It probably makes me a very bad historian, really, but I'm actually interested in the people, how they might have felt. You can't put yourself in their shoes. It's a whole
No.
different ball game. You can't. But some things are the same. Certain emotions are the same, fear, etc., etc. So, but I wish I could say, yes, I went to Haddon Hall, I went to Hever Castle. Sorry, I can't.
Yeah. For a lot of people, it's film and television will also be that sort of gateway that can draw you in.
Yeah, I remember seeing Anne of the Thousand Days, but by then I was teaching and it was slightly different. I always thought that was a darn good film, actually.
When I was about 10, I first started studying the Tudors. By pure chance, Anne of a Thousand Days was on the television. And my mum allowed me to watch it. And that
Yes.
was Firstly, I adored Geneviève Bujold as Anne Boleyn, and for me, she can't be touched.
No, I don't think she can.
She is the quintessential Anne Boleyn for me. But that was certainly my gateway drug, particularly to Anne Boleyn's story, was Anne of a Thousand Days. And from there, I was off. And so a couple of more sort of fanciful questions, I suppose. If you could jump in a time travel machine, you can come back, but you can witness a moment from history. Do you have one?
I mean, it would be easy, I suppose, to say, oh, it would be wonderful to be around on VE night, sense the atmosphere,
Okay.
the relief, I should think, the
Hmm.
exhilaration, or, oh, I don't know, hear Martin Luther's I Have a Dream speech. But if I'm really honest, and I could go back, I'm a child of the 60s. And one of the things I would love to have done, and no, I never did it, I would love to have been in the cavern and heard the Beatles. I would have
Okay.
loved that. Now, is that a moment of
Yeah.
history? I don't know,
Yeah.
but it's a moment of my history. And
Yeah.
I
It's
would
all
have loved
relative.
that.
It's all history. And based on who we're talking about today, if you could
Yeah,
ask Jane Boleyn a single question, what would you ask her?
I think I would ask her about the Katherine Howard episode.
Yeah.
She was
What were you doing?
very, well, exactly. She was so heavily involved with that, it cost her
Yeah.
neck. Katherine
Hmm.
Howard, well, I think she was, I don't know, perhaps she was just very young and very silly. I mean, who knows? But Jane
Mm.
was older and frankly should have known what was going
Mm.
on. And I would very much like to
Yeah.
say to her, why? Why not try
Yeah.
and back
Oh,
out? Don't get
yeah.
involved. You've managed so far. And she had come quite a long way since the debacle of the Boleyns,
Mm.
um, and more or
Yeah.
less fought her way back to favour. But to do something. That just seems to me so stupid.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly seems. I've got a theory on it, and we'll come to that a bit later, I'm sure. Yeah.
I I can't understand anyway. So I think that's probably what I would ask her. How did you do that? Why? Um,
Well,
it makes no sense to
no,
me.
no, it's not at all. So we're here to talk about Jane, obviously, because as you've already referenced, your first book, Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford. I was very keen to talk to you about her, this remarkable woman. To start, we can't be certain exactly when Jane was born. It seems to be circa 1505, something like that.
I would think
Yeah,
that fits in with her later life. If you think of the fact that she was at the Field of Cloth of Gold in 1520, and by then I think she had been at court a bit. If some of the reports are correct, she must have been. Yes, her parents went on that as
yeah.
well, but you didn't take, every member of your family to the Field of Cloth of Gold in 1520. So I think it makes sense that she then would have been about 15, and then she takes part in a masque
Hmm.
at court in 1522 and has a starring role
Yeah, the Chateau
at the
there.
Chateau Vert, that's right. And that in itself is quite interesting because she has actually somehow made herself noticed to get into that. Because if you look at some of the other people in it,
Yeah.
there's Mary, Henry's sister, the French queen, playing beauty, sort of typecast. Mary Boleyn playing kindness. Well, she
Hmm.
was certainly kind in various ways. Anne Boleyn, again typecasting
I
perseverance.
do know that it was pronounced perseverance at the time by all
Oh, was
accounts.
it?
Yes.
Well, I stand corrected. I never knew that.
Yeah, it was pronounced
Um,
perseverance at the time.
perseverance. Really? I suppose it meant the same thing.
Oh, totally. It was just the pronunciation. Tudors pronounced it perseverance.
How interesting. Oh, well, they always say you learn a little something every day.
So, who were Jane's parents and what positions did they hold at court?
Her father, of course, is Lord Morley, Harry Parker, Henry Parker, Harry Parker. Her mother, Alice, the daughter of St. John of Bletsoe, which is in Bedfordshire, I think. Positions at court, not really. Her mother, I think, will have served Catherine occasionally.
Okay.
And both she and Lord Morley were on Catherine's list of retainers, her side, if you like, at the Field of Cloth of Gold, when virtually everybody who was anybody
Hmm.
went, but you were divided into the King's side and the Queen's side. And the Morleys and Jane were on the Queen's side. But Lord Morley was not cut out to be a courtier.
Right.
He was cut out, I think, to be a scholar. He'd have been happy as I don't know, an Oxbridge Don. He liked his library. He liked his translations. Yes, he went to
Okay.
court. Yes, he was in the Lords, and so he sat on various treason trials when necessary, including his own daughters. And once he was an ambassador, one of four ambassadors actually, sent to what was then the Holy Roman Empire, we would think of it as Germany, to present the Order of the Garter to Catherine's nephew, actually, Catherine of Aragon's nephew, Ferdinand, Charles V's brother, who became Holy Roman Emperor. So he did that and wrote a few letters from there, and probably that was 1523, I think, or 1523, I
Hmm.
think, and was drawn by Dürer. He does that, but you don't really find him doing anything else. And maybe that's wise. He died in his bed, which takes some doing if you are going to be a courtier at Henry VIII's reign,
Yes, there's not
at
many
his
that.
court in his reign. Yeah, you're pretty lucky if you do that.
I believe that Jane was actually, well, I mean, most people were, but she was distantly related to the Tudors via her maternal great grandmother, Margaret Beauchamp, who was the mother of Margaret Beaufort, I want to say. So, what was the connection there?
Well, Margaret Beecher married twice.
Okay.
Her first husband was Oliver, and I never know how you pronounce this actually. St. John, St. John. I mean, is it St. John? I don't know. But anyway, Oliver St. John or whatever. Um, and that son, she has a son with Oliver, who then marries an Alice Lovell. And the Lovell girl is Jane's great great grandmother, not great great. So
Hmm.
it comes because of the first marriage of Margaret Beauchamp. And so you get
Hmm.
the Bledsoe line. And her second marriage, Margaret Beauchamp, was to a Beaufort
Yeah.
and the Duke of Somerset. And that's when she has another child, Margaret Beaufort. So it's sort of a bit of a complicated relationship.
Mm.
But yes, she's related to the Tudors via Margaret Beaufort through that second marriage. But
Yes.
as you say, um, if you look at the sort of Tudor family tree, it's so intertwined with all the noble families that, you'd probably have to scratch somebody to find that they're not. Keep looking under stones and you might find somebody who isn't. But yeah, so they are related.
So, at what point did Jane herself begin having a role at the court, and in what capacity?
Very good question. Don't know the answer. Um,
Okay.
the there was well, truth will out. We don't know. Um, Cardinal Wolsey had a gentleman usher, George Cavendish,
Hmm.
who lived through all this period, obviously connected to Wolsey. He didn't like the Boleyns, therefore, whom he saw as helping to bring down the cardinal. But he wrote, as well as his biography of Wolsey, which is well known, he wrote a series of poems called Metrical Visions. And a lot of the people of the Tudor court figure in this, including Jane. And
Okay.
all we have is that he says that she was at court from her young age. So perhaps her family placed her in Catherine of Aragon's entourage as a maid of honor. That was quite common, often was done. Anne Boleyn herself, for example, became a maid of honor, firstly to Margaret of Austria and then to the Queen of France, Queen Claude. It was quite an honor to get
Mm.
your daughter into court. But probably, how old would she be? I should think about 12. But going by when other people had that sort of role. But we don't know. She's not mentioned. If you
Okay.
scour lists of ladies, that there aren't that many lists of ladies, but if you do scour the ones that are there, she isn't. But in order to
So,
have that role, I was going to say, in order to have that role in 1522 at Chateau Vert, she must have been noticed.
yeah, because there were lots of young girls, and there's just seven that are picked.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yet she's there and it's a big entertainment.
Mm.
So she must have been noticed.
Yeah.
But as to when, I wish, but I don't.
So, thanks in large part to historical fiction that has then been adapted into films and television series, Jane is continually portrayed as the sort of archetypal scheming lady in waiting, always gossiping, happily backstabbing for advancement. In reality, do we actually have much insight into when she does get positions at court? Do we have much insight into how she performed her duties and if she made good friends among the other highborn ladies? And I imagine, given how long her court career goes on, she must have actually got along with people quite well. Otherwise, she wouldn't have had that career.
You would imagine, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
As far as I know, there's no concrete evidence on any of that. Um, Whether she was, this great gossip and backstabbing, I think depends on how you view her later on.
Mm.
Because, of course, at the time, she was not castigated in her lifetime, other than the Katherine Howard business. She was not derided or, well, criticized. And clearly, she must have got on with Anne Boleyn. I mean,
Yeah.
we've got loads of examples of that. But I think you could be right. I think if she survives all that time, she's got to have had some sort of personality. She's got to have been fairly personable. Of course, sadly, there is no portrait of her.
I was going to ask you about that because there is that sketch, the Lady Parker sketch, that some people say could be her, but you think otherwise, right?
I don't think so. I wish it was.
Yeah.
She looks a very gentle, sweet young girl. But I think you've got a few problems with that particular drawing. I'm not saying it isn't, because you can't ever, it's very wise to rule
Mm.
things out completely. But there are two or three things against it. One is the age of the sitter. She's quite a youngish girl. Holbein actually came to England twice. Um, Earlier, sort of 1526, 8. I think Jane is just that bit too young, probably then. Came again a bit later, um, and stayed until his death in 1543. But then it starts to get to the point where she'd be a bit too
Mhm.
old, because he comes back, I think, when she's already married. Why would you have that sort of portrait unless it's a preparatory drawing for a lost portrait? The thing that is very much against it is that that particular drawing was
Yeah.
done in the later period, because Holbein used different coloured papers, background papers. Um, the early drawings are on white paper. The later ones are on pink paper. And this is on pink paper. I don't see, so it's got to be in the later period. Well, she's not going to be drawn after Anne's death, although Holbein dies in what,
Mhm.
1543, I think, isn't it? Nobody's going to want her portrait then, because, I mean, she's still a Boleyn.
She's not going to be called Lady Parker by
Exactly.
then either.
She was never Lady Parker, of course. That's another problem.
Mm.
If she's not married, she'll be Mistress Parker or Jane Parker. And once
Mhm.
she's married, they weren't married. She'll be Lady, well, she'll be Jane Boleyn, and then she'll be Lady Rochford
Yeah.
once the Boleyns have started to rise even further. So I think you've got two or
Yeah.
three problems against that. It's far more likely that the girl in that portrait is the wife of Jane's brother, Trace Newport, I think her name was, who
I
died
see.
quite young, sadly. Could even be a second wife, but more likely to be the first. Um, but I think it
Hmm.
makes more
That does make
sense.
more sense, I think.
Whether Jane is one of the,
Yeah.
Holbein's drawings, there are loads of ladies who sort of look at us and they haven't got names. And even a lot of the names are wrong because they got mixed up, the names. And John Cheek, who did
Hmm.
some of the names in Edward's reign, who knew most of these people, even he got things wrong sometimes. And a lot of his names were cut
Yes, he
off.
did.
Um, but whether she's one of those ladies whose names we don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I would obviously Anne Boleyn is, the most famous example of someone who we don't really know
Yes.
exactly what she looked like because there are,
No.
we have those Holbein sketches. I'm much more inclined to believe that the one in the British Museum is Anne, rather than the I was described the double chin one that is inscribed by John Cheek. I know a lot of people believe that is her, but I just can't, I just don't. I can't see
I
it.
can't see it. I can't see it. I can't see it. And the one with the double chin, isn't she in a nightgown? But their nightgowns were, I mean, it's not like an M&S 90 today. Um, they are quite sumptuous garments. But even so, you think she would have wanted to be portrayed in something a little bit more regal, a little bit more impressive. I mean, Anne liked her clothes. She liked her jewels. I don't see her being like that.
Well, on the back of it as well, this is another thing that people often overlook is that on the back of that sketch is the Wyatt coat of arms, which to me
Yes,
suggests it's probably a female member of the Wyatt family.
absolutely. I thoroughly agree with you. I think you're completely right. It's absolutely
Uh,
true.
yeah, but the other one I think is possibly, and actually when you look at the other Holbein that
Yeah.
could be Anne, there's a sketch that could be George, and if you put them side by side, there's a
Uh,
strong familial. connection in the faces?
Maybe. I don't know. I think I go along with the Henry VIII destroying everything um, after Anne's death. I mean,
Mm.
we will never know whether Holbein did actually do Anne.
So to get back to Jane and George, people often mistakenly believe, I think, I could be wrong, but I think a lot of people believe that Jane's marriage to George Boleyn came about because of Anne Boleyn's huge rise at the court of Henry VIII. But in truth, the marriage appears to predate that. Is that correct?
It does.
Yeah.
It does. I managed to find her, well, or reconstitute from another document her jointure.
Okay.
As you know, a jointure was, well, I don't know how to describe it, a bit like a
Contract.
prenup,
Yeah.
I
Yeah. The
suppose.
terms and conditions.
Yeah, it is. Terms and conditions. Yeah, look at the small
Yeah.
print. And Jane needed to. But it's like a sort of dowry. And if you look at that, it's dated October 1524. And we also know that Wolsey in 1525 gave George extra money. £80 a year he was given. It's in something called the Eltham Ordinances, which was sort of regulations for court. And he gave him £80 a year in addition to the £20 he had for he and his wife to live upon. So they're certainly married. It's got to be sort of 1524, 25. And Anne isn't really coming to prominence until late 25. So, no, it's not sort of on the back of that. On the other hand, Mary Boleyn, kindness in the Chateau Vert pageant had been Henry's mistress. And the family did very well out of that too. So, and Henry contributed to Jane's dowry. He actually contributed 1,000 marks, which is a lot of money. And the dowry itself was 2,000, which is a lot. So date-wise, I'm afraid it does predate. Doesn't mean the Boleyns weren't up and coming as they were. It was a good match for both sides.
Yeah. The state of the marriage is consistently portrayed negatively, that the marriage was this big failure. And what people will often use against them is the lack of children. Now, where does this come from? I mean, obviously, marriages of the nobility, the gentry, the nobility, are all about siring as many offspring as possible. But a lack of marriage, a lack of children doesn't mean a bad marriage. Maybe they just couldn't have children, you know. But where do we see this negative side coming from?
I don't think you do at the time. You see it later when Jane is
Okay.
being castigated. Not actually, I might add, well, no, that's not entirely true. You see it at the beginning in Elizabeth's reign when she's supposed to be jealous of George and Anne. Nothing in her lifetime was ever said. I'm inclined to go with you. I think it was probably a tragedy for both of them. They didn't have children. There has been talk
Yeah.
that the marriage was a bad marriage because George was homosexual. Show me the evidence. He gave a book to Mark Smeaton. Well, I've handed out books. To my female friends, it doesn't mean I'm gay. My husband has given to men some of the books. It doesn't mean he is. That's just a silly thing. I've even read that George abused Anne. That is straying into the realms of fantasy, surely. There is nothing to indicate that. I mean, what you do get that suggests to me that the marriage was okay, despite the lack of children, is that a bit later on, at the time of Anne's fall, George was asked whether his wife had told him, to put it bluntly, that Henry was no great shakes in bed, and that she had heard this from Anne. Well, that shows you how close she and Anne were. women get very close, but they don't discuss the sexual prowess of their husbands to all and sundry. Well, if Jane repeated that to George, they've got to be fairly close, surely. You don't just suddenly come out with, oh, guess what? So I don't think it's such a bad marriage. Obviously, she offered to visit him in, prison and things, but whether that's right or wrong, people have looked at that and said, well, she sent word to him via his enemies. Well, most people were their enemies by then. But no, I don't think there is any evidence whatsoever that the marriage was a bad one.
The later things around accusations of George being homosexual or just being extremely promiscuous, the thing that people often overlook, the people that talk this rubbish about George sleeping with anything that walks, seem to
Yeah.
ignore the fact that to the best of my knowledge and belief, there was never any mention of George having illegitimate children.
No,
So and
not
that
at
would
the
have gone hand in
time.
hand, and it
Yeah.
doesn't, you know.
Yeah, that's right. And I think if he had had an illegitimate child, he would probably have acknowledged it.
Yes.
The Duke of Suffolk had illegitimate children. He acknowledged them. Henry VIII had an illegitimate son, for goodness sake, in
Hmm.
Henry Fitzroy. He acknowledged him.
And as Anne Boleyn's ascent at the court, it does go through the roof. How does Jane benefit? And what are the signs that she remains loyal to the Boleyn name at this
She
point?
certainly benefits financially. I mean, the Boleyns, when they're in favour, get so much. Um, Jewels, estates, uh, a carriage. Um, they were given, were allowed to live in, not exactly given, it wasn't quite the same thing, the Palace of Beaulieu, which had once been in Essex, which had once been New
Yes.
Hall, and had once been a Boleyn property, but had got sold to Henry VIII, who'd given it the biggest refurb you've ever known in the whole of your life, and turned it from, something relatively modest into this charming, madly expensive palace. They had that. They had silver plates with their initials on. They had bed linen with G and J
Mm.
on it. Um, they had, well, you name it, they have it. So financially, she does very well.
Yeah.
She even has a scholar at, I can't remember whether it was Oxford or Cambridge now, Cambridge, called William Foster. And she was supporting him, and he said how good she had been to him. So she does very, very well financially. And at court, well, she was one of the ladies who accompanied Anne just before Anne's marriage to Calais, when Anne was reunited, because she knew
Hmm.
him from earlier times, with Francis I. And Anne was one of the ladies who danced in a very special, well, it was put on really, mask, at which Anne danced with Francis. In the coronation, she had a massively important position. She was, almost as close to the Queen as you could get. She was ahead of her own mother. Um, so she's doing very nicely, thank you. Um, I don't think she's thrown all that
Mm.
away. And clearly with Anne, they must have got on.
Well, I think the evidence points to actually a close relationship between Anne and Jane. And you said there about why would she throw that away? It is actually illogical. She was a Boleyn and had been for quite some time. And I think we can see that there's a quite a it's just clear evidence that the two women trusted each other, that they joined forces to root out a suspected affair that Anne thought Henry was having. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah, that's absolutely correct. Um, Anne had just had a miscarriage, and Henry was apparently looking at another woman. Um, and this
Hmm.
other woman was supposed to be close to Princess Mary, who was one of Anne's bête noires,
Right.
because she was terrified, of her position in the line of succession, even though she'd been, well, not quite declared illegitimate at that point. But, she's a danger to Elizabeth, etc., or any child that Anne might have. And it's not, the story goes, I mean, it is actually documented that Jane and Anne had this conspiracy where Jane would somehow quarrel with this new, we don't know her name, favourite. Henry hated quarrels. He hated female tears. He couldn't cope with those. And he couldn't cope with feuding and quarrelling women around him. No. So if there was a quarrel, he'd send the new favourite from court. Well, you know what they say about the best laid plans of mice and men. The one who got sent from court was Jane, not the new favourite, who disappears into the ether. We don't know what happened to her, who she was. And Henry's relationship with Anne, anyway, was up and down and terribly volatile. And Anne and Henry were back together again. Quite when Jane came back to court, exactly how long she was rusticated, we don't know. But probably a short period, because she's certainly back, later on. So I think the two actually got on quite well.
Yeah, it's very telling, isn't it? Because what that is telling us is that
it is.
Anne trusts her sister-in-law enough, and Jane is also.
Yes.
Jane is she's a working Boleyn. She is doing what she can in support of and in protection of the Boleyn name.
The firm.
The firm, yeah.
The firm. Absolutely. I agree completely. And I don't think, this idea that she would then go against them completely. I can't buy it. For a start,
no, it's illogical.
It's totally illogical. I mean, the only thing I read once, and I can see it could be slightly credible, is that Jane didn't like the way that Princess Mary was being treated. Lord Morley kept in with Princess Mary. And maybe it suggested Jane didn't like that. Jane felt that Mary was being badly treated, and so started to go off the Boleyns. But hang on, no. She'd not mentioned this all the while Anne was around for years. Why would it suddenly surface? I don't see it. So, you've got to have motive if you're going to tell lies.
Yeah, and I also think that Anne Boleyn has been somewhat unfairly tarred with the whole Mary brush, because I think it becomes abundantly clear in the wake of Anne Boleyn's execution that it was always Henry was the one making the decisions on Mary's treatment and what was expected of Mary. I think that obviously Anne and Mary will have had a difficult relationship, but I think that in reality it was stemming from the king. I don't think Anne Boleyn herself probably particularly cruel to Mary. I think it all came from her father.
I don't know. It would definitely come from Henry, because Anne wouldn't dare do anything against Mary, that he would be against also, or against Anne, that is. But I think Anne did see her as a danger. I think the problem for Anne is her vulnerability.
Oh, sure.
She is incredibly vulnerable.
Yes.
It's awful to think that biology is quite so important here, but she's got to have that son. If she could have the son, fine.
Yeah.
But until she's got that son, she would never feel safe.
That's what I loved about Claire's Foy's performance. What I loved about that performance was I felt that it conveyed Anne's vulnerability, and her behavior is entirely propelled from deep-rooted insecurity.
Absolutely. She's totally insecure. I mean, all she's got is Henry's love. And that's not enough. If she could have the son, then she wouldn't have worried so much about the mistresses. He'll go off and do what he wants to do. Secure. She's the queen, she'll be there. One only has to think back to, Elizabeth Woodville and Edward IV. Edward the Fourth, practically did sleep with anything. But Elizabeth Woodville wouldn't have worried that much because she had sons.
Yeah.
Okay, they ended up in the Tower and got murdered somewhere along the line, but she wasn't to know that. But she had sons. She was safe. Anne never is. Not really.
Well, and on that
So,
subject, of course, everything explodes in May 1536. George and, well, actually, six men are arrested alongside George to get away with it, on a suspicion of adultery with the Queen. Ever since, the story is that Jane was the chief witness who provided evidence against her husband and sister-in-law. We've already sort of made it clear we both think this is nonsense, but where does that stem from? Where that theory that it was Jane?
it's never said in her lifetime. Never. And that's one thing I think is in her favour. Let's suppose she did. For some reason I can't fathom. Supposing she did make up stories, certainly on the incest bit. Well, I think that would have been broadcast to the hills. It would have been the most wonderful coup for Cromwell, who partly masterminded Anne's fall. To be able to say George's own wife gave evidence. As far as the evidence goes, of course, we don't know exactly what was said. What we do know is that there is something called the Bag of Secrets. And the Bag of Secrets still exists with records of trials. But the records of trials will give charges, dates, verdict, not testimony. What happened before a trial is that people were questioned. Interrogatories, they called them. Now, some of these have remained. They were never put in the Bag of Secrets. They were wrapped up in bundles and put in Henry's study. And over the years, they disappeared, a lot of them. So we don't know exactly what happened with the questioning for Anne's trial. What we do know is that Lord Justice Spelman, who was there, said that the evidence came from a Lady Wingfield, who was dead by then but had been a friend of Anne's, from Kent. John Hussey, who was connected to the Lyells, reported that it was the Countess of Worcester who gave the evidence first of all,
Worcester,
and
yes.
Nan Cobban and one woman other. He does not mention Jane. So her name was not around then. It was not bandied about. Guess what? Anne's sister-in-law said that she had witnessed hanky-panky going on right, left, and centre, including between brother and sister. Nothing actually surfaces until Elizabeth's reign. And by then, Catherine. Yes. No, I'll get there in a minute. Jane has laid herself open to any charge you want to give, because she has aided and abetted Katherine Howard in deceiving the king. And by then she was that bored, the Lady Rochford. But even then, in Henry's reign, they didn't say. In Jane's lifetime, she also gave evidence against her husband. The only time she's mentioned is this business about relaying to George Henry's lack of strength and prowess, I think that was phrased as, in the bedchamber. So it comes later, and it comes when they need a scapegoat.
Yes, because in reality, I mean, as I understand it, George Boleyn says, "You're going to judge me on the word of one woman." But the reality,
That's
that
right.
one woman is probably Lady Worcester.
Perhaps. Or Lady Wingfield. Maybe Lady Wingfield left a sort of deathbed confession. I don't know. But certainly he didn't say, "It's my wife." And, Chapuis, no friend of the Boleyns, the ambassador for Charles V, doesn't say. He's actually surprised at the lack of evidence that's given. And he certainly doesn't say,
Yeah.
George's own wife condemned. He would have. I'm sorry, he would have. It's human nature.
Of course he would. He was such a gossip.
Yeah, yes. Oh, but isn't he wonderful? He's
Yeah.
absolutely delicious, isn't he? I love Chablis.
Oh, he's wonderful. He's such a yeah. He's a window to the court for us. He
He,
really
well,
is.
he actually is, isn't he? And he's witty and clever. I love him.
So after George and Anne's executions, what did life look like for Jane? Did she remain in contact with the Boleyns, the remaining Boleyns?
Not really. Um, she had a problem in that absolutely everything that they owned was now the property of the king. If you were a convicted traitor, all your property, down to the last cooking pot, was the king's. And what
Hmm.
she was allowed to have was that jointure business suddenly comes into play. And it had said that she would get 66, the equivalent of £66 a year to live on, which, considering she had had heaven knows how many times more than that before, is a big come down. In fact, she was done on that because it was usual to get 10% of your jointure to live on, because of course it's income from lands, but she only got 5%. And she wrote to Cromwell and asked if the money could be increased. And again, this has sometimes been said, well, look, Cromwell helped her, didn't he? And she says in her letter, it's the only one letter of hers that has survived, that she will offer him her prayers and her service. And so, therefore, she is his spy. Therefore, this is her reward because she gets a bit more money to live on. It's up from £66 a year to 100. But that is all. So she doesn't do fantastically well out of it, except a couple of years later, in 1538, there's a settlement with Thomas Boleyn. Thomas
Hmm.
Boleyn wanted to settle his affairs, I think. He was getting older. His wife died, and he wanted to try to basically put his affairs in order. The Boleyns had crawled to try to get back into favour, but hadn't happened. But Anno Domini was setting in, and he wanted to exchange some manors with somebody and sell some to somebody called, well, a chap called Baldwin, who was a Lord Chief Justice, I think. But a key area was, in fact, Jane's in her jointure. And so he comes to an arrangement with Jane in 1538, which is basically a very, very fair land settlement. And she gets the equivalent of £200 a year to live on, plus she is given the Boleyn house at Blickling in Norfolk.
Okay.
So by
Hmm.
1538, she does get something. But that's her contact with the Boleyns. And Mary Boleyn, of course, had gone from court some years earlier when she committed the terrible Boleyn sin. When you were a Boleyn, you married up, you didn't marry down. And Mary, of course, had
Mm,
married beneath her, as it was suggested. Um, but
yes.
1538, yeah. But other than that, not really. Um,
Okay.
yeah. Jane is back at court, of course, with Jane Seymour, and serves her, and was probably around. I mean, she may have been one of the ladies in the bedchamber when Jane Seymour gave birth to Edward. We don't know. What we do know is
Hmm.
that she played a big part in Jane Seymour's funeral. Princess Mary was the
Right.
chief mourner, and Jane was one of the seven, I believe it was seven, women who carried Mary's train. Princess Mary, that
Okay.
was, who by then was reconciled to her father because she had basically buckled and said everything he wanted her
Yes.
to say, and so she was forgiven. Back then, and then of course with Anne of Cleves, she's back.
Yes, I was going to ask you about Anne of Cleves because I believe that Jane is instrumental in actually helping Henry VIII achieve his separation from Anne through what Jane was able to inform him. Is that
She
correct?
wasn't the only one,
Okay.
but Henry VIII, as you know, took one look at Anne of Cleves, and that was it. No way he was actually going to become involved with her sexually. And he tried to get out of the marriage by saying she had a pre-contract with somebody else, etc.,
Mm.
etc. But Jane was one of several ladies who used to talk to Anne. And on one occasion, they were sort of joking and saying, we'll soon get a new Duke of York. And Anne said, oh, yes, I'm sure that will happen because Henry kisses me every morning and kisses me every night. And they were, well, in between, and she was incredulous. What in between? Incredulous or clever, I don't know. I've always thought she's rather clever, Anne
Oh,
of
very
Cleves.
much.
She comes out of everything very well. So Jane was happy to say that this is what had been said, which indeed supports non-consummation. And when Anne voluntarily agrees to end the marriage, Jane is one of the witnesses. So in that
Okay.
sense, she helps Henry. But as I say, I think, Henry was delighted that Anne gave no trouble. I mean, think of that Catherine of Aragon woman. Look at the trouble she caused when he was trying to get the marriage annulled. And there's this one being really nice about it. Good on you,
Yes,
Anne.
whistling off into the distance.
Absolutely, with
Richmond
nice
Palace, Hever
houses.
Castle.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And deciding to stay here rather than be married off to some other awful creep. That's what I mean. I think there was a little bit more to Anne of Cleves, I think, than people give her credit for.
Absolutely. She's the
Um,
survivor.
she is. She really is.
Yeah.
She's
Yeah.
absolutely fine. She goes away, and I think is it she who has the pet monkey and loves marzipan? I think it is actually. Um, has a pet monkey and loves
Mm.
marzipan anyway. But certainly, I think she does remarkably well.
Yes. So she serves, obviously, the
Yeah,
teenage Katherine Howard next. By this point, I imagine Jane was one of the eldest and thus most experienced ladies in waiting.
she must
Yeah.
be. She must be, mustn't she? She's certainly one of the longest serving. You would think she would be sensible about this. I mean, Catherine is very young. I mean, I always love the fact that she has this motto, no
Mm.
other wish but his, except there seem to be a lot of hises around, whose wishes could be satisfied with poor little Catherine. Um, but Jane, of course, is brought to trial well, not brought to trial, it was an act of attainder, no trial, just declared guilty, because she helped Catherine find hiding places on royal progresses where Catherine could meet. In fact, by
Yes.
then it's Thomas Culpeper. And Jane sat there, um, she said she went to sleep and she didn't know what was going on. I mean, come on. I can't believe that. I mean,
Been around long enough, Jane.
well, exactly. And there was that wonderful occasion, I always think it's delicious, when Catherine and Culpeper were in the room and Jane was with them. And somehow the door got locked by the night watchman and they couldn't get out. And Culpeper's servant happened to come along and had to pick the lock to actually release them so that they could get out. I just think that's gorgeous, sort of sitting there saying, what on earth do we do? And we're sort of stuck. Somebody's going to find us, somebody's going to find. Now, why did Jane do that? I don't, that's the question. That's the question.
Yes, that's what I was.
Yeah,
Yeah, I was going to ask you motive here. I mean,
yeah.
some say she was living vicariously through Catherine. What do you think was her motive?
But the only theory I think makes sense, which has been suggested, and I, I think you'll probably agree with me on this one, perhaps, is that once you've helped the Queen once, that's it. If she orders, she is the Queen, and she was quite an imperious little thing. And she could easily have said to Jane, this is what I want. And the trouble is, once you've done it once, that's it. And I mean, how are you going to get out of it? You can't suddenly go to Henry. Well, she couldn't get to Henry anyway. That wasn't how the Tudor court worked. She would have had to have done it through her father or her brother right at the beginning. And since Henry was besotted with Catherine at the beginning, I don't think that would have washed. So what does she do?
I have to admit, I sort of lean on Occam's razor here of the simplest solution, probably the most logical. And I think it
Yeah,
is, as you say, Catherine is queen. Jane is a lady in waiting.
yeah,
She was following
yeah.
orders, and she followed orders once, and then probably was thinking, "What are you doing?" But she's agreed to do it. What can she do? I think she can't get out of it. I think it's that straightforward, really.
Well, that's what I would go for.
Yeah.
Um, it's the only thing to me that makes sense. And I don't know how you would get out of it. Even if you've just done it the
Mm.
once, I don't know how you'd get out of it.
Yeah, because she could have approached the king. She could have got a message to the king, or however, he could have exploded and said, "You're trying to besmirch my wife." It's almost an impossible position to be in.
I think it is. I mean, obviously, when the you know what hits the fan, it is done through a woman's supposedly saying, Mary Lascelles, I think, saying to her brother, I don't want a place in the Queen's chamber because I think things are going on. And
Mm,
he's in a terrible position because if you conceal it, you are as guilty as if you'd done it yourself.
yeah.
But if you actually say this is what happens, is Henry, as you say, going to say you're besmirching my wife? And in fact, they worked through Archbishop Cranmer and got a message to Henry, and everything took off from there. But no, I think Jane just well, that was the question you asked me at the beginning. What would I ask her? That's what I'd ask her. It
Yeah.
truly is because I don't see why you would do that.
So she's arrested alongside Catherine. As you've said, she's found guilty via an attainder. Now, it's believed that during her imprisonment, Jane goes insane. And this necessitates a change in the law for the king because there was a law that said you couldn't execute someone judged insane. What is your reading of what's going on here?
Well, we do have, I think it's in Risley's Chronicle, they have her being taken from the tower. She's under sentence of death, by the way, but being taken
Mm,
from the tower because, she is deranged and is taken to Lord Russell's house on the Strand to the care of Lord Russell's wife, Anne, and that she recovers her wits because you weren't supposed, as you said, to execute somebody who was basically mentally ill, although they did.
hmm
But she's supposed to have recovered her wits. So hey ho, let's get that executioner, going. I don't know very much about the changes in the law. Actually, I know they changed the law a lot in the 18th century, but I don't know very much about it in Henry's reign, actually. So, if you do enlighten me, the second thing I can learn today, because I actually don't know.
Well, as I understand it, the Henry basically pushed through a bill in Parliament that had to be pushed through that
Right.
changed the law so that he could execute her.
Well, you're probably right. I don't know. I know that she was supposed to have
Mm.
recovered her wits, and certainly at the end she
Yeah.
behaved very well, as far as we know from the one eyewitness account that we actually have that is correct. We have forgeries
Yes, which I'd
later,
like to.
but there is just the one.
Yeah.
Somebody called Otwell Johnson wrote to his brother about it. He saw that execution.
Yes, which I'd like to come to next, which is, she is executed on the morning of the 13th of February, 1542. Uh, do we know if she was present? Like, was it Catherine? I mean, Catherine died first because it's a
Yeah,
rank-based thing. But do
that's
we know
right.
if it
Yeah.
was if they were on the scaffold together, or was there a bit of a time
I
between?
don't think so. It seems to have been one and then the other,
Okay.
but the other, not witnessing. But I think it'll be Catherine and then Jane, I think. I don't think, when you think about it, actually, logically, if she's um, become unstable at one point and you
Yeah.
think she's okay again, and then she watches Catherine die and thinks, I'm next.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't think of much more that would push you over the edge again, really, can you? So I reckon. I reckon she came out
Mm.
afterwards, and I presume there was straw and they cleared it a bit from the blood. I don't know. And that Catherine's body had been taken to, well, they go into the church, don't they? St. Peter ad Vincula, where they still lie.
It was a private execution, wasn't it? It wasn't before the crowds on Tower
Yeah,
Hill.
it's not on Tower Hill. Although these private executions are never quite as private as you think. I mean, I always used to think with Anne Boleyn, there's a handful of people.
No,
No,
about the house.
for Anne Boleyn, there was probably about 500.
Mm.
Katherine Howard, probably less. But there would have been a few dozen at the very least, probably more.
Yes.
And we have just one eyewitness account that is definite. A chap called Otwell Johnson, who writes to his brother. Yeah. And he said that Jane died bravely. She made a short speech acknowledging that she deserved to die, and the king was just and merciful, and pray for the king. She
Mm.
did the usual scaffold speech. Um, Later on, in the 18th century, a chap called Letty, I think his Christian name was Carlo, I think, forged but then he was always forging everything. He forged loads of letters from Anne Boleyn that didn't exist. Forged a deathbed confession at which she said that she had lied and brought about Anne's death, but it's just not true. He forged so much, and the person who was there did not say that. So I don't think so. And the stories anyway don't
Right.
surface until
Okay.
Elizabeth's reign, when they've got to
So,
surface. Um, for the
yes.
obvious
So,
reason. Sorry, I was just going to give the obvious reason, but well, it's only that.
no, no, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. Oh, okay. All I was going to say was that in Elizabeth's reign, you've got a bit of a problem because she is the daughter of Anne and Henry. Well, obviously, her mother was, a saint walking, and Henry was a just and wise king. So if Anne was innocent, Henry either killed an innocent woman, oh, he wouldn't do that. No way, he's a just and merciful king. Or somebody told him to. Somebody told him lies. He was tricked. And who have you got who was there? You've got a woman who then is executed for aiding and abetting Katherine Howard in adulterous relationships with, well, certainly with Culpeper and possibly with Derham. She's laid herself open to that, but it doesn't actually, there are no accusations in her lifetime,
Yeah, she's an
not
easy
till later.
scapegoat.
Um, an absolutely easy scapegoat. Yeah. She's
Mm.
that bored, the Lady Rochford. And there are, various things that you can see. You can actually follow the way the stories develop in the 16th century, and then, in Elizabeth's reign, plus, and then by the 18th century, she is the Wicked Witch of the West. Therefore, she had been backstabbing all her life. Therefore, she had been gossiping all her life. Therefore, she had been lying all her life. Therefore, she had hated her husband all her life, etc., etc. And then you get, the myth. Unless we're all mistaken and she did it. But I don't think so.
Well, it's carried on into the modern day as well, hasn't it? Because every
Oh, yeah,
interpretation of Jane Boleyn in film and television is the one note shrew who, I mean, in particular, the depiction of her in the 1970s television series, Henry VIII and his six wives, well, the six wives of Henry VIII, sorry. She's vicious in that. She's quite spiteful in Wolf Hall. Yeah, she has not fared well in film and television either, which has been a big part of, I think, for modern audiences in particular, in shaping her perception.
absolutely. When I first started writing about her, I remember talking to a friend of mine, and she said to me, "But you can't do her. She's awful." I suppose that's partly what attracted me to the topic in a sense, um, to try and unpick it a bit. And I
Mm,
wasn't sure which way I'd go. I knew that I believed Anne and George had not committed incest. And I knew that Anne, I don't think, had slept with anybody except Henry. Partly because the Tudor court was so claustrophobic that you wouldn't dare. You'd know you'd get caught. You'd know you'd be found. Well, tell that to Katherine Howard, I suppose.
No.
But you would know you'd be caught if you've got, any sense at all. Just need sort of 2 brain cells, really, to see that. But I did think I'd like to look into it and see if I thought there was a bit of an injustice. And I think there is.
Well, to conclude then, very few women of this time were around to witness so much of the drama of Henry VIII's reign. Do you think that that is what Jane's legacy should actually be? That this is a woman who saw essentially it all?
Partly that's what made me actually write about her, because she was there all the time. And in the background, and we knew even if she wasn't actually mentioned in some of the documents as being present, she would have been present. So that we know. And yes, I do think that's part of her legacy. But I think also maybe it's not just that she was there all the time, but it's that maybe you shouldn't accept myth without questioning it. Maybe we should actually, I don't say someone's innocent until proven guilty necessarily. It's not a court of law. But maybe we should just try and get a bit more background first. Try and see what makes some sense. And then maybe look at history, because that's probably true of so many things in history. There are myths. And sometimes you perhaps need to unpick a myth.
Well, thank you very, very much for coming on the podcast. This has been so fascinating and really interesting to discuss this woman. So what are you working on next, if you're able to say?
I'm not, because we haven't decided.
There you go.
I mean, that is the absolute truth. We think we'll do another book together, my husband and I. And we've got a few ideas. But what we thought was we'd probably have the summer or so to sort of think about it a bit, and then really settle down in September and, actually hone a couple more ideas. Well, we've got a few, sort of a slate, some largely Tudor, but not entirely. Possibly a sort of an 18th century one. I don't know. We're debating is the truth. That really is the God's truth. Yeah. So I don't know, but we are intending to write something else and do it together.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much again for coming on the podcast, and hopefully have you back on another point.
You're very welcome, Adam. Very, very welcome.
That brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chest podcast. My thanks to the wonderful Julia Fox for coming onto the show to discuss Jane Boleyn with me. Next week, I'm thrilled to be welcoming back Ellen Harrison onto the podcast for a discussion on her upcoming book, The Many Faces of Anne Boleyn. If you have any suggestions for future podcast episodes, please do get in touch via Instagram. I would love to hear from you. Thank you again for listening to the Tudor Chess podcast, and catch you next